enjoyed being among the people we were with in Cambridge, where we didn't even have to pretend that anything like that makes sense. It felt like being at a Black conference in about 1935. Right now, I'm doing something that I should have done 30 years ago. I never got to it. I'm reading Arnold Rampersad's biography of Langston Hughes. I had never gotten through, partly because it's 2 volumes and it always looks kind of intimidating. But I realized, it's time. I need to do Langston in a way that I never have.
I'm old, John. I remember when Arnold Rampersad was writing that book.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Nathan Huggins, the historian, Harlem Renaissance, was my colleague when I was in Afro at Harvard in the early 1980s, and he talked about Rampersad all the time.
So it's a damn good book. And the thing that I'm always struck by reading about his era, well, right now I'm in the 30s, the 20s and the 30s, is that there was so much less of a sense that you were un-Black to, for example, write a sonnet, the way white people write a sonnet, that you were un-Black if you didn't talk in a certain way. There was more of a flexibility, and partly it was because no matter what level of society you occupied, no matter how accomplished you were going to deal with brutal and pitiless racism from whites. So there was no question as to whether you were Black or not, no matter how accomplished you were. So I get it. But it meant that there was more flexibility within the Black community, and there seems to have been much less of a sense that in order to be celebrated, you needed to argue that standards needed to be changed. You weren't, the white establishment wasn't interested in knuckling under to that. And it's maybe the one thing that I would enjoy about living in that time, that there was much less of that idea that the essence of enlightened Black Americanness is to insist that what's considered excellence be changed for you. No, Langston Hughes wouldn't have understood that. And I enjoy that part of his era.
And neither would W.E.B. Du Bois have understood.
Not at all. No.
These guys and gals they wanted to play the real game. They wanted to actually be in the mix, in the real game. Now, there were very few, but they knew what the real game was.
Yeah, and it's not as if Hughes wasn't changing the art form. He's writing a vernacular kind of poetry. He's getting away from what, say, Alain Locke thought of as poetry. And so all of that is fine. He is changing the form of art, but he wasn't arguing that it was supposed to be easier. He worked just as hard as somebody writing a sonnet on his poems. The idea wasn't, let's dumb it down because what we Black people are about is spontaneity and heat. No, he wouldn't have gotten that. And as such, whenever I read about these people, these Harlem Renaissance heroes, Du Bois, Locke, I'm having a brain shut out. Hughes, Claude McKay, Wallace Thurman.
And you don't want to forget the woman who was the anthropologist and Zora Neale Hurston.
None of those people a lot of today's enlightened Black thinkers could not get through dinner with most of those people, including Zora, because she was a Black conservative, couldn't get through dinner. They'd be thinking, oh, let me sit down and talk to girlfriend. They'd be thinking, oh, I'm going to sit at the feet of Wallace Thurman. But what those people thought of as standards, what those people thought of as achievement, what those people thought of as the Harlem Renaissance would really rankle a lot of people today who see themselves as representing Black authenticity. And I hate to say that in some ways, today's Black orthodoxy is advanced. I can see that. These old timers were blinkered in some ways. But in other ways, I think there was I don't know who doesn't love themselves, but those people were securer in their skin in a way.
I'm sorry, I was about to ask whether after the advent of Black studies was part of a step in the wrong direction, away from engaging with the very best of whatever the field is that you might be at the highest level, and instead having your own separate track. I mean that to be a question or hypothesis, not a conclusion, but I think it's at least worth entertaining.
Yeah, I think that idea that what the Blackest thing to do is to smoke out evidence of racism, that you build an identity around that. Unfortunately, my impression is that Black studies departments focus on that. Now, I don't know. Really, to say it, you would have to do a study of probably about 100 of them. But my impression, based on, for example, having been a member of one of them at UC Berkeley for about 10 minutes 30 years ago, and, nosing around, my sense is that those programs tend to be centered on racism. Like, it would be one thing if they were really interested in exploring Blackness in general, where racism would be maybe 1 out of 10 things focused on.
Oh.
I get the feeling that's not true, and that most of those departments are called Black Studies, but what they're really about is identifying and exploring discrimination and racism. And that is a very narrow subject.
Yeah, I mean, that may be the case at, I don't know, a Cal State Fullerton or something like that. I wonder whether or not it's the case at a Harvard or a Yale or a Princeton. And I mean, I know, having taught in a Black Studies department way back in the early 80s, that there's serious people.
Mm-hmm.
My colleague, the late Nathan Huggins, historian, was a very serious historian. My colleague at that time, Werner Sollers, a German national literature guy, very serious guy. So but that's probably not true of every Black Studies department. The students are going to be playing some kind of role in what the department is doing, and the very idea that the racial identity comes into the pedagogy causes me a little bit. I'm saying we're there to educate kids at a college, and when you partition it off, it's like you think there's some kind of racial epistemology, if there's something to know that's a kind of Black way of knowing and a Black way of learning and things like that, rather than to integrate the themes of race and Black history and literature and art and music and whatnot into the curriculum more broadly. I mean, American studies makes all kinds of sense to me.
Mm-hmm. And it's where you learn a synthesizing way of thinking. I mean, one would have to do a study. I did a very, very small one, I think about 15 years ago, where I looked at the syllabi of a couple of Black Studies departments. And that's not a study, but what I found, and I wrote about this, people can look it up in City Journal. And what I found was that it's not that the people weren't intelligent. It's not that the scholars were undertrained or something like that, but the whole curriculum was based on racism rather than race. There were some exceptions, but it was clear that the mission of this Black Studies program was to teach people about discrimination. And I just say, that's not enough. That's not a real subject. It's too small. And also, of course, all of the Black thinkers who were given any real play were on the left. There's nothing about Black people who think differently, and I'm not talking about myself, but you would think that there was only one Black way to think. That's not right. It's not true that there are only 2 Black conservatives and both of them are crazy. And yet you wouldn't have known that from this program.